Je me suis habillé comme un voyageur, venu à ce pays pendant 2 siècles. Oui. Vous parlez français? Il y a quelqu'un ici qui parle français? Oh, je pense que tu as dit ça. Portuguese. Français. Well, French would have been one of the languages you would have heard along the Mississippi River a little over 200 years ago. Because this is part of New France. You know, sometimes we hear about the 13 original English colonies. We hear about the Spanish colonies. But a lot of people don't realize that from Canada all the way down through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River, from St. Louis all the way to New Orleans was New France. Nouveau France. And it was that because they claimed it as a colony. Some of the early colonists that came here came by sea, and water was really the superhighway of 200 years ago or more. We didn't have roads in this country. We didn't even have good trails in many places. So waterways were the superhighways. I tell people the Mississippi River was kind of comparable to Interstate 80 nowadays, which was going east and west. Mississippi River was a major highway going north and south. And when you think of everything that had to be transported, it would be very difficult to carry it across the land, either by hand or people didn't have horses then. So boats and canoes and even floating down the river were the way that people traveled. So the paddle was a very, very important tool of the Native Americans as well as the early voyageurs, fur traders, and not only the Mississippi River, but the Mississippi River makes some great connections to the Great Lakes in many places. And so the Great Lakes also became a very important part of the fur trade. Now, I'm going to talk about the fur trade, but before I do, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the Wagner Red. I'll start at the bottom. It's hard to see for you back there, but I've got buckled shoes on. Buckled shoes were a style that was very popular for several hundred years. Everybody that wanted to be well-dressed had a pair of buckled shoes. They didn't have buttons, they didn't have ties, they basically wore buckled shoes. And everybody that wanted to be well-dressed had buckled shoes. Interesting thing is, there's no right and left. These shoes are called straight last. A shoemaker would measure your feet and make a shoe to fit your feet, but there's no right or left. It depends on the way you buckled it, whether it became a right or left. And if it got worn out on one side, you can actually switch sides because there's 2 straps. And depending on which way you put it into the buckle, you can switch your shoe. Also, they're wooden pegs. They use wood pegs to attach the sole to the shoe. So the right and left was not actually invented or became popular until about the time of the Civil War. Civil War soldiers started wearing right and left hand shoes. But before that, almost all shoes were made straight. The other thing about the buckled shoe, if you ever look at old pictures, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson all had buckled shoes. But during the French Revolution, some of the kings and queens and higher people wore buckled shoes. And so the commoners, the people that actually had the revolution, started wearing tie shoes. And Thomas Jefferson actually switched from buckled shoes to tie shoes in support of the French Revolution, because the French really helped us during our revolution. And so we were very supportive of the French cause at that time. Next thing I've got on are stockings. The stockings were made out of wool. They made out of different material, but wool was the most popular. And one of the reasons for wearing stockings, it was a style at the time for men who want to show off the calves of their legs. And I'll tell you an interesting little story. I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard that it probably is. Benjamin Franklin, who didn't do a lot of hard physical labor, but he was very intelligent and did a lot of other things, he didn't have very big calves in his legs. And he actually had somebody carve wooden falses to put on the back of his legs to make his calves look bigger under in stocking because he wanted to show off his leg. The other thing is I've got breeches. Sometimes we hear about breeches or breeches. The breeches were made out of wool or sometimes even leather. In fact, in this country, during the fur trade, one popular item were deer hides and elk hides. And deer hides were being sent over to Europe because leather breeches became very popular, made out of American deer hide. And so, you think how soft the chamois is, well, that's kind of the way the breeches were, probably comfortable. They were button front, of course they didn't have any zippers or Velcro or anything like that, so they had to be button front and button in the side. The other thing I've got on is a long sleeve shirt. And it was a custom at the time, nobody, to be proper, would have gone with a short sleeve shirt or shorts. People just didn't walk around with short sleeve shirts or shorts. Always long sleeve shirts. About the only time you can put your shirt up is if you're doing something like blacksmithing or something manual labor, maybe in the field, you could unbutton your shirt and roll it up. But almost never would you be seen without something covering your shirt. That would be like walking around in your underwear. And so to have the vest on or a coat over that would have been proper. And usually buttoned as well. I'm getting a little bit this outgrowing these. so I don't button it. But the other thing that you'll notice is my hat. And the three-cornered hat was very, very popular. It was a style at the time. Everybody that wanted to be well-dressed 200 years ago, 300 years ago, had a three-cornered hat. They varied in style. This is kind of a French style. English, Americans adopted it as well. The three-cornered hat, of course, when I do this program with children, they all say, oh, a pirate, But I tell them that pirates, as well as everybody else, wore three-cornered hats. That was a popular style to wear. And in fact, everybody that was well-dressed wanted to have a three-cornered hat. There were certain ceremonies that you did with a three-cornered hat. For instance, it's called a cocked hat. I used to think it's called a cocked hat because they cocked up the brim, but that's not why it's called a cocked hat. It's called a cocked hat because the proper way to wear a three-cornered hat is to put it on and cock it so that the peak is over your left eye. And the reason for doing that is the military also wore cocked hats. And when they fired their muskets, they wanted to keep the hat out of the way of firing the musket. It was just better to have it cocked to the side. And that was a style. There was also a thing where you had a cocked hat. If you'd see somebody in town, to salutate them, to say hello, you take off your hat. You call it doffing your hat. You take off your hat and kind of bow and present your hat. It was more about showing your hat off because you were very proud of that hat. And the reason you were very proud of that hat is because the best hats were made from what? Beaver fur. The beaver fur is some of the best material for making felt. This hat is made out of felt. Felt is made by the fur of an animal. It can be made by rabbit fur, it can be made by wool, it can be made by almost any animal that has fur. Okay, not a cow, not a horse, they don't have fur. But any animal that has fur, you can use for making felt. And this hat actually is quite a bit of beaver fur in it. It's actually a true beaver hat made out of felt. So, one thing that when the early voyageurs came here, in fact, let me go back and talk a little bit about some of the first explorers come here. Of course, the Native Americans lived around here for 10, 12,000 years at least, and they were here well ingrained. In fact, as some of the colonists on the east started moving this way, they started pushing some of the people west. So, for instance, like the Ojibwe and the Meskwaki, they were more Great Lakes tribes. And they were pushed kind of to the west, up into Minnesota and down into Iowa. And they probably displaced some other tribes that lived here at the time. But some of the first explorers to come here, some of the early ones, and there's some very early, but I will mention Marquette Joliet. We all know about Marquette Joliet. Marquette was a Catholic priest that was at a mission up around Green Bay area, okay? And he was up at Mackinac and then down near the Green Bay area. And he was a priest that was a friend. In fact, Louis Joliet had been in the seminary, studied to become a priest, but then he left. So they became friends in the seminary. So Joliet then was actually hired by the French government to look for this river that they heard about in the central part of the country. When the colonists arrived on the East Coast, the English colonists, when they arrived, I'm going to do it backwards, on the East Coast, and when the French colonists came in from the upper part, and the Spanish from the bottom, they were looking for something, and that was a water route going from the Atlantic to the Pacific. There were a lot of riches to be had in the Orient, spices and all kinds of things. It was very, very difficult to go around the bottom of South America. And of course, there's no Northwest Passage over the cold Arctic area. And so they were looking for a water route. And that continued for hundreds of years, looking for that water route through the United States, through South America. Of course, we've got it now. You know, the Panama Canal was actually dug to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific. That changed a lot of things. But prior to that time, Marquette, Joliet, LaSalle, Lewis and Clark, all of these people were looking for that water route. Whoever could find that water route from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that country would have a lot of clout in the world, a lot of riches. And so Marquette and Joliet, that's one thing they were looking at. They heard that there's a big river, and they thought on some of the early maps, if you look at the real early maps, some of the maps go from the Mississippi River, they draw it right across the country and out to the Gulf of California. They used to think that's where it came. That's where the Colorado River comes, they found out later. But they were hoping that was the Mississippi River that came out there. Well, early on, some of the Spanish explorers had gone up the Mississippi River, but not that far. They didn't know where it went to. They didn't know the source. And some of the French explorers from the Great Lakes, Marquette and Joliet being the first ones that are recorded in history, came down and found the Mississippi River with Native American guides that knew about it all the time. And they actually went down the Mississippi River. They heard about tribes of Native Americans that were kind of dangerous on the west coast of the Mississippi River, Iowa and Minnesota. And so they kind of stayed on the Wisconsin and Illinois side going down the river until they got to almost southern Iowa, down near Keokuk. And they saw some Native Americans along the shore, and they were invited into their village, and they were well fed. They fixed a whole big feast for them and everything like that. The interesting thing is, they found, now remember, these were the first Europeans that actually traveled down the Mississippi River that are written in history, but they found that the Native Americans down in southern Iowa already had trade goods that they couldn't have gotten anyplace else except from trading with Europeans. And they figured they actually probably traveled up to Green Bay area. Because, you know, you think of Native Americans living in villages here or there, a lot of them traveled. They had canoes, they could travel far and wide. And that water route, like I said, was an important highway. So they would paddle up to Green Bay, take some of the riches that they had, especially some of the furs, and trade them for trade goods that they couldn't get, mainly metal objects. Because the Native Americans, of course, didn't really work too much metal except for copper. So the beaver, and here's a beaver, when they were trapped, they would be stretched on a frame like this and dried. And before they were dried, they would actually take and scrape off all of the fat, all of the meat. They had to get all of that off the hide. Once they scraped it, they would let it dry. And these pelts, in French it's a plus, would be traded then, almost like money. And these would be traded for different things. Another pelt that they traded for were the otter. Otter were also in demand for fur collars, for hats, for muffs, different things that they could use, but not making felt. So it was the beaver that was used in making the felt, that soft underfur. When they took these hides and traded them to the fur traders, they would often do it on credit. The fur trader would bring some of the trade goods, they'd give them to the Native Americans, they'd write it in a book, who owed what, and as they trapped and got the beaver pelts, and they would pay off their debt. The one important trade item were wool blankets. You can see I've got a couple of wool blankets, a red one and a white one. And the interesting thing about these wool blankets, maybe you've seen this before, the Hudson Bay and some other companies made them. See, this one is Hudson's Bay. 3.5 lines on it. You know, I used to think that that meant they had to trade 3.5 beaver, and actually it's pretty close to that. But actually, this tells you how heavy the blanket is. You can go with a 2-point blanket, a 3-point blanket, a 4-point blanket. This is 3.5. So this tells you the weight of the wool that's in this blanket, and it's pretty close to the value of maybe 3.5, sometimes 4 beaver to get a blanket like that.
The
Other
higher
items,
the number, the thicker the blanket.
yes, the more lines, the thicker the blanket. They're sewn right into the blanket too. They're not just drawn on there. They're actually stitched right into the blanket as part of it. And so the wool blanket, what they would not only use for warmth, but they'd also make clothing out of it. What they call a capote, they'd wear it as a hood. Some of the other items that they would trade for would be buckets. You know, think of it. The Native Americans used clay pots, and the clay pots were heavy, they were fragile. They didn't have metal buckets. When they could get a metal bucket like this, that was really something. And they would be used and used and used. Even when they split, they'd sew them together with wire or solder them together, use it over and over until it basically fell apart. And once it fell apart, then they would actually cut it up and use it for making jangles and bracelets and things like that, so it would be well used. The other thing you've got to remember is all of this stuff, all of it, had to come in birch bark canoe. That's hard to imagine. You know, you think of a birch bark canoe as being a craft that is not very strong. And the birch bark canoe actually is quite strong. In fact, they used to make birch bark canoes that were 36 foot long. The big cargo canoes were 36 foot long and had about 12 or more men that would paddle those canoes, and would be full of tons of trade goods. One thing they did to conserve space is they would have buckets that were called nesting buckets. They'd have all different sizes that would fit inside of each other, from the largest to the smallest, smaller than that. And so these nesting buckets wouldn't take up as much room in the canoe. So that was a popular trade item. Some other trade items were beads. They had beautiful glass beads, and something that became very popular were silver objects. So here are some silver trade crosses. And of course, one thing about the European, they're also bringing their religion to the Native American. And so by having these crosses, sometimes it promptly started with missionaries bringing the cross, but eventually it became just a trade item that people wanted to own. That silver was a valuable metal. And so the one with a double tree on it is called the Cross of Lorraine. It comes from a French cross, Croix de Lorraine. And so the beads were important. Here's a small brass container right here to fit inside of there.
All this came from Europe.
All of these came from Europe, yeah, or Canada. Sometimes later on they started making things in Canada and Europe and East Coast, the East Coast, and trading them. Spoons made out of pewter would be a trade item. Arrowheads would be a trade item. Spearheads. Probably one of the most important trade items would have been fire steel. Here's fire steel. All the fires previously had been started by, well, all fires then were started by friction, but they used to use wood against wood. And the wood would get very hot, to make a spark, but when they could get a steel like this, then they could take a piece of flint and get sparks off of it and catch some of those sparks on some charred cloth, put a little tinder on it, and then quickly make a fire with flint and steel. So these were very, very important trade items. Clay pipes, even though the Native Americans made pipes out of pipestone from Minnesota, the clay pipes were also very much in demand in the fur trade. And tobacco. Where did tobacco come from? Tobacco came from the Americas, but they would actually grow tobacco in South America and other places and repackage it and sell it back to the Native Americans that would smoke that tobacco.
So they ship it back to Europe and make tobacco?
No, they probably made it on the East Coast, maybe down in the Cuba area or like that. Some of the Spanish maybe produced the tobacco, wherever tobacco would grow well. And of course, the Carolinas then became a great tobacco producing area that would then, the fur traders would buy that. These fur traders too, they didn't just operate by themselves. They were actually associated with big companies, Hudson's Bay, the Northwest Company, many different companies that actually hired what they called the fur traders. And if a fur trader went out by themselves to try to trade, they were called a woods runner. They were actually operating illegal. They didn't have a license to carry on the fur trade. And so these big companies then would control the trade. Another important metal item would have been hatchets, tomahawks. In fact, something interesting, the fur traders, and something very popular was a three-cornered hat, and people like to show off their three-cornered hats in Europe and in the colonies. But Native Americans, when they could get a metal tomahawk like this compared to a stone one, they wanted to show that off. In fact, you see a lot of paintings of Native Americans, even photographs, and they will be carrying that tomahawk in a very situation where they're displaying it. They want everybody to see their tomahawk top. In fact, some of the fur trade companies would make extra large blades, larger than you could really be practical, but they want to have that big blade just to be able to carry that around as a kind of a status symbol.
What's the cup on top of that?
The cup is actually a pipe. Yeah, it's the hollow,
Okay.
and they can actually use it for smoking. So it's a combination piece pipe and tomahawk. Another metal item would have been a beaver trap. And you notice how this trap is all folded up. They were made like that on purpose, so they could fold in, not take up much room in the canoe, and when they got ready to use them, they could unfold the springs and set the trap. And this is a hand-forged trap made by blacksmiths years ago. It's an original one, old beaver trap, and they would then compress these springs, open the jaws, and the jaws would hook under that little lever. The pan would come up, keep that trap set, and they would actually set that down underwater. They'd find where the beaver were making a run out of their dens or out of their lodges. They would set these down underwater, stake it with a pole or put a wire on it. And a lot of times to attract the beaver, they would use some kind of a lure. And the French name for a beaver is castor. And the Latin name is castor canadensis, Canadian beaver. And so that word castor, coming from the Latin, is also like the French. A beaver, near its anal area, has two glands called castors. And those castors, actually I kind of like the smell of it. It smells a little bit like black licorice to me, which I love. But the castor gland, each individual beaver has a certain smell that they use those castor glands to mark their territory. And so one thing that during the fur trade what they would do is when they skinned the beaver, they would save these castor glands. Oh, and believe it or not, they'd use some of that in making perfume as well. And but they would use those castor glands and they'd give it to other Native Americans or fur traders that were going to put that, if you take that, put it in along the river or in a pond where there are other beavers, they're attracted right to it. They want to come and smell that other beaver that's in their territory. And sometimes there'd be a trap set right below where that lure was up on the bank. So these traps would be used for trapping beaver. There were drowning sets, so the animal would generally be drowned by the time that they checked it the next day.
Did they get close to wiping out the beavers eventually?
They did, yeah, very close to wiping out the beaver. There was such a, you know, a lot of times we think of the early fur traders as being the trappers. They didn't do the trapping. They were just the merchants. The Native Americans did all the trapping. And all they did was to trade for these furs, bring them things that they wanted. The Europeans wanted the furs. Okay, it changed a little bit when they got out in the Rocky Mountains. Some of the mountain men were also trappers themselves, but they still carried on a fur trade and probably bought a lot of their hides from the Native Americans that were used to doing it. Prior to the trap, the way the Native Americans used to get beaver is in the winter when the fur is prime. Prime means that a real thick fur, there's a lot of fur there. And they'd want to trap them during the winter. So sometimes they'd actually cut a hole in the ice. They'd find bubbles under the ice where the beaver would go from their lodges to their den. And they'd cut a hole in the ice and put a net down there. And they'd have some people that would be on either side of that. And then they'd have some of the Native Americans start pulling apart the lodge. And they'd chase the beaver out of the lodge. And as they swam underneath that ice, they could pull them out on the ice and then actually spear them, kill them that way. Some other ways they had are like different snares and everything like that. But when they could get the trap, that really changed fur trapping, because now you could set a trap and go home. You didn't have to be out there on the cold ice and waiting for the beaver and tearing apart the lodge. You could just let the trap do its job. So that really changed things. I mentioned Marquette and Joliet. Some interesting stories about them. They did not get all the way down the Mississippi River. They went down probably to, they figured maybe around Arkansas. And they returned by way of the Illinois River up into Lake Michigan. They went back up to Green Bay area. Father Marquette never made it. He actually died on the way. He got sick on the way back and he was passed away. But Joliet then returned, and he was on his way to, he almost got to Montreal. And just down or up the St. Lawrence River from Montreal, there's what they call Lachine Rapids, the China Rapids. And he overturned in Lachine Rapids. He lost all of his maps and all of his journals that he had kept. And so the only ones we have to go by were word of mouth, what he could remember, and Father Marquette's journals, which did survive, you know, and so that's what we have. Later on, after Marquette and Joliet, since they never got all the way down to the bottom of the Gulf, that was in 1763, or 1673, I'm sorry, 1673. But then in 1682, a man by the name of René Robert Cavalier de La Salle, you've heard of the name La Salle, his name is so long that they just usually say La Salle, made it all the way down the river with a whole bunch of other military who was sent by the French government. And when he got to the Gulf, he then proved that the Mississippi River, instead of coming out in the Gulf of California, went to the Gulf of Mexico. He planted the French flag, and he says, I claim all of the Mississippi River Valley and all of the shores for the great country of France. And so he claimed New France, basically. And that didn't last too long until the English and the French had a war, the French and Indian War. And like I tell students, I say, who do you think won that war? And if they don't know, I said, what language are we speaking here? We're speaking English. If France would have won that war, and this is the fact, we probably would have been speaking French right now. Because it really depended on who controlled the French colonies. New France, which went all the way through the Great Lakes, basically on the western Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River. And so we now speak English, but La Salle claimed that. And while LaSalle had claimed it, there was another man named Nicolas Perrault. How many have heard of Nicolas Perrault? Okay, Nicolas Perrault was sent out by the French government, and he was to go from the Great Lakes and all the way up the Mississippi River, and he was to explore the Mississippi River and pick out fort sites that would be good for the French to occupy along the Mississippi River. One fort that he picked out was in Prairie du Chien. His name was Nicolas Perrault. What do you think he named his fort? Fort St. Nicholas. And so there's a fort then. We know about Fort Crawford up in Prairie du Chien. But long before Fort Crawford, it was Fort St. Nicholas, okay, which was a French fort. And the other thing about Nicolas Perrault, he actually established a trading site in East Dubuque. And East Dubuque was trading with some of the Native Americans who were living around the Dubuque area and on the Illinois-Wisconsin side as well. And one thing that he found is you can imagine lead ore. In French, it's plomb sulfuré, sulfur lead. Okay, and this lead ore, or galena, was used by the Native Americans around here. They probably used it for decorating pipes and other things. It's not hard enough to be used for making tools, but when they found that, and of course lead is a very important tool in firing the muskets and adding to pewter and other things like that. So this is a very important mineral found around this area. And so his fort across the river actually encouraged some of the Native Americans to bring furs and lead over to his area over in East Dubuque. They don't know exactly where it was over there, but they have an idea where it may have been. And so lead became very important. Now think of that. That's 1690. When did Julien Dubuque go? It wasn't until 1788, almost 100 years later. So the lead was well known in this region long before Julien Dubuque arrived.
So the lead wasn't good, like to make spear points?
No, not it's just too soft.
Yeah.
In fact, this lead ore, this galena, people wonder about me touching it. This is a pretty stable form of lead. And to actually get the pure lead out of here, you've got to smelt it. You've got to cook it for a long time. And you're basically cooking out some of the impurities, mainly sulfur. There's also zinc in it. There's also iron. Sometimes you see pyrite in it. But by cooking that sulfur out, eventually the pure lead melts out. Once they had the pure lead, that was very soft. It was good for making bullets and other things. A lot of roofs were made out of lead. In fact, in Europe, I guess a really well-known lead roof is on the Vatican. St. Peter's Basilica is all lead. We've seen stories of Notre Dame, when they had the fire. Now they're trying to mitigate all the lead from that roof. So the whole roof was covered with lead. So lead was a very, very important roofing material. And so it was a valuable product that came. Can you imagine taking lead and putting it in a birch bark canoe and taking it back up into the Great Lakes to Montreal? They did. They actually did.
All the lead came from the Americas and went back to Europe?
Well, they had some in Europe too, but not it was really depleted. So they were really good, easy to get supplies here. So they actually took some of it all the way back up. That's why later on, St. Louis and New Orleans became very important, because it's a lot easier to take lead downriver than it is back upriver and through the Great Lakes. So the lead trade became important along with the fur trade. Now the other thing I'm going to do, I've got this three-cornered hat on, which most people in Europe wanted to have, most men, some women, but it wasn't very practical for canoeing. You probably would lose that hat very quickly. So a lot of the fur traders and voyageurs would wear a different hat. This is called a toque. And the toque would come in different colors. Red, if you're coming from Canada, you'd probably have a red one. if you spend a whole winter out, and the way they would do it is they'd bring all these trade goods out in the fall, and they would usually set up camp or cabin or something near an Indian village where they're going to be doing the trading. And then they'd spend a whole winter out there, and in the spring of the year, after the ice melted, that's when they would take the furs and the lead and everything back to their main trade offices or whatever, what they called a factory. What they call these little trading areas out along the river and the Great Lakes were called factories. And so the head of the factory is called the factor, the head of the trading locally. But they would wear these toques. The blue was more of the Illinois and Mississippi River color. And if you had a white one, that symbolized that you spent at least one winter living out with the Native Americans in a village. And so the toque would be worn like this. And so sometimes you see people with a toque on in their canoe. That's much more practical for keeping your head warm and paddling a canoe. And at night, when you slept, you can actually, the reason it was so long is you can actually pull it down over your head. You might be under your blankets, but your head's out, so you might have to pull it down to keep your head warm.
Those are made of wool?
They're made out of wool, yeah, made out of wool. Some other things that they would trade for would be the flintlock musket. And just to show you, I like to show people that it's not loaded. This is a muzzle-loading flintlock. It was made for the trade. You can't look in the back. So what I always like to demonstrate before I do anything is to take the ramrod out, put it down the barrel. You can see there's a little bit sticking out. And so we'll use that for a measure. And I can see it comes almost to the back of the gun. Not quite, because there's a plug back there. So this gun's unloaded. It's a flintlock. And they're made in France, England, Belgium. A lot of different countries made the flintlock. Early on, some of the early guns had a dragon on the side. And that became something that the Native Americans really liked. You know, there were stories of dragons and sea monsters and everything like that. So when they could get that dragon in the side plate, there's certain things, you know, sometimes your market drives the demand. And so the dragon was one thing you saw in a lot of the guns. The other thing you saw was a huge trigger guard. A lot of the Native Americans in winter wore wool mittens or gloves, and they wanted to be able to reach in there and pull that trigger without having to take off their glove every time. And so they had a big trigger guard. They were very simply made, sometimes cheaply made. Some of the barrels were very thin, not well made. Some of them blew up, but it was a very practical gun. It's not rifled, it's smooth, so it could shoot either a ball or shot. And it is a flintlock. Native Americans had flint, of course. They used the flint for making arrowheads and spear point. So the flintlock, there's the piece of flint right in here. Here's the steel. They would load it, put in the gunpowder, and oh, and by the way, that's another thing that would be an important trade item. Would be the gunpowder and the bullets and everything to shoot the gun. One of the bullets right there. And once they sold these guns to the Native Americans, of course, it's kind of like a modern computer printer. Once you buy the printer, now you have to keep buying toner and ink and everything to put in it. Well, the gun was the same way. You'd buy your gun, and you'd have to keep buying powder and bullets and everything to shoot it. The nice thing about the flintlock is it takes powder and a ball, and then you put some gunpowder in this little groove right here. There's a hole going through, and when you close the frizzen, the steel, this is the way you'd carry it at half cock. Shouldn't fire in this position. But when they went to fire it, it was a spark then that dropped into the powder to make it fire. And so this is a gun that they like. 12 beaver pelts would buy a gun like that. 12 beaver pelts. So it shows how valuable the beaver were.
And they shot lead bullets.
Lead bullets, yeah. Shot lead bullets. The other thing that The other thing you've got to think about too is a lot of people travel between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. And there's no waterway that directly connects the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes. The closest we have here is the Wisconsin River. The Wisconsin River and the Fox River coming out of Green Bay come pretty close in central Wisconsin. Anybody know what town? Portage. And that, therefore, it got its name, Portage, because it's a portage between the Fox River and the Wisconsin River. So when Marquette and Joliet came down from Green Bay, they actually started out going up the Fox River. And the Fox River actually comes down through Wisconsin, but then makes a bend back up into Wisconsin, but not too far. Actually, it's about a mile, they said, between the one bend of the Wisconsin and one bend of the Fox. And they could come into Wisconsin. When they got to Wisconsin, it was a very easy trip then, just downriver, right into the Mississippi River. Yeah.
In my reading, I've always been intrigued with that town, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It starts with, they have a long word, but I mean, it's really featured in all your, that was a main point for everybody. You probably know a lot more about it.
Up in Door County, you mean?
Well, it's no up in that, something like this, but all that was the point for anybody going anywhere. And,
Yeah, through
I
Mackinac.
think Julien Dubuque even worked there for a year.
He did,
before came
yeah.
back. So you know much about that? I mean, it was a central point.
Yeah, Mackinac was a very important area. It's where a lot of the Great Lakes come together. It came down from, there are several ways to get down from Quebec, but one was, I think, into Lake, I don't know, Lake Ontario or something like that, and then down into, I'd have to look at a map now. But they eventually got into Lake Superior, Lake Michigan. Lake Superior had its own portages going down the, into Wisconsin, what they call the Sugar Lake. I forget the name of it now. I camped there, you know. But there's several different portages. But the Wisconsin Fox was the important one. That mile, you know, just think of carrying all this stuff, whether it be furs or trade goods. When you got to that bend in the river, you had to go a mile. There's an important tool that all the fur traders knew how to use. And that was this. This is called a tump line. Tump line would be something that would be put over your forehead, like this. And the straps would go down your back, and with these straps then, you could tie on your chest, your furs, a whole bunch of stuff, and they would try to have all of the furs tied into about 90-pound bundles. All the trade goods, anything that they had would be like 90-pound bundles. And each voyageur, each fur trader that was going to make a portage would carry 2 of those bundles. Yikes. So they'd have 180 pounds on their back. And believe it or not, you know, if you had to do it by hand, that'd be difficult. But believe it or not, your head is very, very strong in your backbone, and you can carry a lot of weight just on top of your head. You know, you see African women carrying water on top of their head, heavy, heavy water, you know, because your backbone is very strong, much stronger than your arms are. And so these tump lines were a very important tool for carrying some of those things. That's really the only way they could make those portages. So they might make several trips, carrying all their trade goods, you know. Yeah,
They didn't use wheels or anything, they used their backs. They didn't use, and how did they carry the canoe? They just carried it?
the canoe, they would come back and carry that on top of their head. Yeah, so they'd have people carrying the canoe separate, and they'd put the paddles up in the thwarts of the canoe, carry that on top.
They couldn't make a portage in one trip.
No, probably not, no. Unless they had a lot of people, but no, they would have too much. Some of those cargo canoes, like I say, could carry tons of stuff. 36 foot long, you know, just think. They're wide and they're long, and they just have them packed. In fact, this trunk, believe it or not, was actually made from a design that was carried in the canoes. And it's exactly the size that they would have and they would put it in the bottom of the canoe. They'd use it for sitting on while they're canoeing, but in the meantime, it had a lot of valuables in there for trading or whatever. When Julien Dubuque came in 1788, you know, sometimes those of us from this area think, oh, wow, he came down here all by himself. He had 10 other people that worked for him, 10 Frenchmen that worked for him, French-Canadian. And so he's just kind of the head of the company. He didn't come by himself at all. And when he established down at the mouth of Catfish Creek, and there's a huge Indian village now. Kettle Chief was his name, the chief of that village. And most of the Native Americans that lived down there were actually half-breed. They're a mixture of European and Native American. So they're kind of a village on their own that lived right at the mouth of Catfish Creek. You go down there now, you see nothing. I often go by there and I figure, where did they live?
Yeah.
Think of this, the railroad that went through changed a lot of it, and the bridge and everything like that. So it's not like it used to be years and years ago. But the Native American village, I guess, was quite extensive, and those are actually the people that buried Julien Dubuque when he died in 1810 up on the hill. And they were his friends, they worked for him, they mined a lot of the lead, as well as some of the Frenchmen that worked with him, and sold a lot of the lead. Julien Dubuque, you know, sometimes you see pictures of him in buckskins. I'm not even sure he owned a pair of buckskins, because I translated a letter. I do speak French, and I translated a letter of Julien Dubuque, and in his letter, I saw where he was actually writing for somebody to bring him supplies when they came through from St. Louis, and his coat was getting kind of worn out, so he asked to have a new coat made by a certain tailor in St. Louis and bring it up, and oh, and by the way, I want this coat in the latest style, he said. So he was not a person to be going around dressed like, you know, maybe some of the Native Americans living here. He had a coat and very well dressed. And the other thing is, in about 1805, somebody else came up the river named Zebulon Pike. Zebulon Pike. Sometimes we hear about Pikes Peak in Iowa. I used to tell students in Iowa that I used to do this program to. I said, I want you to do one thing if you've never done it, and that is to visit Pikes Peak State Park. Probably one of the most beautiful spots in our state, where you can look off across the river and see where the Wisconsin River is coming out of the state of Wisconsin. And that is where Marquette and Joliet and a lot of the early fur traders, voyageurs came out. And it's a gorgeous area. And that was named after Zebulon Pike. Zebulon Pike was traveling up the Mississippi River at the same time Lewis and Clark were on their voyage of discovery, looking for the water route to the Pacific. Zebulon Pike was looking for the source of the Mississippi River and also to establish forts. And he was told by the U.S. government to visit Julien Dubuque, because we are looking at all that lead around the Dubuque area. And the U.S. government was very interested in all the lead. So when Julien Dubuque heard Zebulon Pike was coming, he was ready for him. Zebulon Pike came up the Mississippi River, and right down below the monument, believe it or not, Julien Dubuque had a cannon. And he fired his cannon off, not to keep the Zebulon Pike away, but as a welcoming, to welcome their party of soldiers coming up the river. So he fired off his cannon as a salute. Zebulon Pike came. His intent was to see Julien Dubuque's mines, except one unfortunate thing for Zebulon Pike: he had diarrhea. And he couldn't travel very far inland. So Julien Dubuque told him about the lead mines. Well, there's really not that much lead around here. And so Zebulon Pike, he convinced Zebulon Pike it's not really worth the U.S. government's worrying too much about the lead around here. So Zebulon Pike continued on up. The Pikes Peak is named after him. Pike out in Colorado is named after Zebulon Pike. So, he's kind of an important person in about 1805, early explorer.
When you got here, you had diarrhea.
Yeah. one way to get rid of it. So. Let me talk a little bit about everybody's interested in food. Of course, you know, this program right at noon. So whether you ate lunch or not, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the food of the voyageurs. They didn't have refrigeration. They didn't have ice boxes, of course. So their main diet, one of their main diets, was right in this bag. And if you think about it, you know, nowadays, you know, people might take beans or something like that. Well, beans are from this North America, or from the Americas, I should say. And they aren't really from Europe, but something that is from Europe are peas. So peas were one of the main diet of the fur traders. And they would take bags full of dried peas, and everybody in the canoe that was traveling or trading, they would take a bucket, and they'd take 2 big handfuls of peas for everybody in the canoe and put them in that bucket in the morning. And then they would put water in it and let them soak all day long. And by evening, they often canoed from morning sun up until sundown. And every hour they would stop, and what they called it in peat. In peat means you have a chance to take your pipe and smoke a pipe full of tobacco while you're using the restroom or smoking your pipe just to kind of stretch your legs. And these big canoes, just think about it, you could only paddle on one side. So you had to paddle all the time just on one side. So maybe at each hour they switch sides, give that one arm a break, and paddle on the other side. Except for the person in the back, the gouvernet, which would be the person that steers your canoe. They could switch back and forth. So these peas then would be soaking all day. And also, what you would do is probably have some salt pork. Some pork that was really, really salty. And it was mainly fat. You know, if you ever open a can of pork and beans, you always find there's just a little piece of fatty pork in there. You know, well, that kind of carry over from when people used to put salty pork in their peas or in their beans. And these peas, if you think about it, there's a nursery rhyme that goes back to Europe called peas porridge hot. And that's the way I'd eat it the first night. Peas porridge hot. Peas porridge cold, that's breakfast. And peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. You would never throw it out. You would just add more the next day. And when you cooked it again, it would kill any bacteria or germs in there. And it could very well be that some of it's 9 days old, still in that pot. You never clean it. You just keep adding. The other thing that they ate, see if I can find one that's not broken. Of course, everything had to be dried, completely dried. Anybody ever see any of these? During the Civil War, it's called hardtack. And that was the main ration in the Civil War. But that was the first time people started calling it hardtack. Before that, they were known as sea biscuits. And sea biscuits were carried on ships. The sailors on ships that have barrels full of these dried sea biscuits. If they get wet, they get spoiled very quickly. But as long as you can keep them dry, they'll last for years. And so these hardtack is just basically flour and water and salt. Of course, when you bake it, the water goes away, so it's just flour and salt that's cooked like a big, thick cracker. And this would be the ration, the sea biscuit. And the voyageurs also would have the companies that made these for them to carry, along with the peas. They might have sea biscuits. Something interesting is there's a famous racehorse. You know, maybe some of you are old enough to remember the name Sea Biscuit. And so it's named after the sea biscuit. And something I found out later is I think one of the offspring of sea biscuit they named hardtack. Kind of interesting.
Is that why they got scurvy? Because there's only...
Yeah, no fresh fruit or anything like that. Of course, the fur traders probably could get some fresh food. They would trade along the way or whatever. But on the ships, yeah, they got scurvy pretty badly.
Do you know anything about pemmican?
About medicine?
Pemmican.
Oh, pemmican. Pemmican was where they would take dried meat, like buffalo, elk, deer, and see with the dried meat, I think I have some of it in here. They would actually, Native American women would make it, and, well, I can't find it right now. But they would actually take the dried meat and put it in a mortar and pestle, and they'd pound it up. They'd almost make like a ground up dried meat. They'd grind it up, and then they would take a big sack made out of leather or whatever, and they'd put dried berries in it, they'd put dried meat in it, anything they wanted to add, and then they would take fat of an animal and pour it over that whole mixture and mix it in. So it was actually a very high calorie fat, dried meat, and dried fruit. And that's probably one reason they didn't get scurvy, because that dried fruit then had some of the vitamins they needed. So Native Americans, they learned how to eat that from the Native Americans, but the fur traders and voyageurs would also use that. Here's something kind of fun. Music. Everybody likes music. And the fur traders carried with them this instrument. They didn't have room for guitars or violins or anything like that. So they carried this instrument, known as a jaw harp. Actually, some people call it a Jew's harp, but actually that's a misnomer. That's really not a true name for it. In French, it's a harpe à jouer, which means a playing harp. And so that's where the misnomer of the Jew's harp came from, but it's not. So a jaw harp or a mouth harp, and you can't hear it very much like that, but in the mouth, whoop, whoop, the spring got a little bent in this one. Sometimes the spring gets bent and it doesn't play right. That's something that they used to play. The other thing they did, in fact, they would sometimes hire fur traders for their singing voice. First of all, they were very short. They wanted short, stocky people. They wanted people that were strong, that could carry a lot of things with their portaging or whatever. They didn't live long. They could only work until maybe or I should say they didn't live long, but they could only actually work until maybe they're into the 30s or 40s, because it was such hard, grueling work. And they also liked to find people that could sing. And one song that they sang was Alouette. And sometimes they would sing the songs, it would be kind of a cadence to paddling. If you've ever paddled a canoe, if everybody just decided to paddle whenever they wanted, you'd be... So it's very important to hit that paddle into the water if possible altogether. And if you're going upriver, of course, it has to be faster, harder. Going downriver, maybe a little slower. And so sometimes the songs would help with the cadence of the paddle. One song is Alouette. I think most of you have heard of Alouette. Alouette, Alouette, chante Alouette. Alouette, je te plumerai. Alouette is the name of a bird that is called a lark. A lark. Okay? Alouette means a lark. Alouette, gentil means gentle or nice. Alouette, gentil, alouette. Alouette, je te plumerai. Je te plumerai. That means I'm going to pluck your feathers out. It's a joke. And that's why they start listing the parts of the bird. Alouette, gentil, alouette. Alouette, je te plumerai. Je te plumerai la tête. Je te plumerai la tête. Hey, la tête. There you go. And this is where you say, hey, la tête. Alouette. Oh, alouette, gentil, alouette. Alouette, je te plumerai. Je te plumerai le nez. Je te plumerai le nez. Hey, le nez. Hey, la tête. Alouette. Oh, alouette, gentil, alouette. Alouette, je te plumerai. Of course, we could keep going. We could list all the different parts of the bird, and then it would be hard to remember them all in sequence, so that's probably when the song would end. But, so singing was important. The birch bark canoes were used. I want to say that if you're really interested in fur trade, here's a book that is really good. You know, it's called Where Two Worlds Meet, The Great Lakes Fur Trade. It's just an excellent book. It's got all colored photographs of different trade items. There's actually a lot of stories. I could keep going, but you know, I don't want to keep you here all day. But I will answer any questions if you have any questions about the fur trade.
In your experience and in your research, what are the largest differences in how the French Empire and their trading representatives interacted with the indigenous folk in the neighborhood versus the American expansion into the Northwest Territory that had recently opened up, the Zebulon coming out here? Like, what was the basic functional differences?
Good question. The functional differences between the French and the English and the Spanish and the American. French actually, they say, got along much better with the Native Americans than a lot of other cultures. And one reason they did is they were out here living amongst the people. A lot of times they would take Native American wives or mistresses, you know, but there was a kind of a familiarity that they had with some of the tribes. And Julien Dubuque, for instance, when he came here, he would have been able to come here, except he made friends with some of the Native Americans here. He was invited to come. He didn't own the land. In fact, later on, after his death, there was a big lawsuit from chateaus down in St. Louis that wanted to get Julien Dubuque's land. And they didn't win the lawsuit because they actually determined he didn't own any land. There's no land to be given. The Native Americans allowed him to come here. And so that was pretty true of a lot of the French. They got along well. A lot of them accepted the missionaries. In fact, a lot of the Native Americans would settle around missionaries or some of the forts. The Americans are a little different. You know, that's more of a expansion. Lewis and Clark, as they went out west, you know, they were looking for routes to the ocean, but they're also looking to see how America could expand. When France lost the war to England in the French and Indian War, instead of giving the land to England, they ceded it to Spain because they were closer to Spain than they were to England. And so Spain kind of occupied and took care of the land for a while. That's why this is called the Mines of Spain, the Mines d'Espagne, and in French. And so Julien Dubuque, being pretty smart, shrewd fella, when he wanted to mine here, and when he first arrived, land was controlled by Spain. He had to write a letter to the French governor, to the Spanish governor, asking permission. And so he named his mines the Mines of Spain, and that kind of set well with some of the Spanish government to know that it wasn't the French mines or the American mine. And so, you know, I won't say it was perfect by any means, you know, because any European culture coming in was kind of displacing some of the Native Americans. But they say the French actually got along better than the other cultures did.
Did they just kind of read the tea leaves? So like, we're obviously, there's going to be no expansion for us here, so we may as well play the field as it stands instead of manipulating the field to our favor.
Yeah, and the Native Americans really had a dislike for Spanish. In fact, I've got a beard. None of the fur traders did. They were clean shaven. And the reason they were clean shaven is because there were really bad stories of the Spanish with their beards coming in and being very mean to the Native Americans. And so they distrusted people with beards. So fur traders wouldn't wear beards, basically, and because of that.
You just mentioned the Indian, I mean, when they got these beavers, they had to store them somewhere. So I suppose if they had a village, they'd be okay, but when the Americans going out and doing their own trapping, during the winter, they got to store the cash somewhere. Was there any particular kind of places where they try to hide their beavers?
A lot of beaver were stolen. You know, the fur traders experienced that. You know, what did they do with the beaver pelt? 40%, at least 40% of the beaver pelts that were trapped were spoiled. They never made it into half, you know. And so one thing, when you have a big pile of furs all together, you can get bugs in it, and it can get hot, you know, they can get spoiled. If they get wet, that they just rot, you know. So they say at least 40% never made it into half.
Rodents might like them too. Rodents
Yeah,
might get into the furs.
getting into the fur, yeah, rodents and a lot of beetles and things like that would just devastate it, you know. So
Would you comment on the rendezvous?
what's that?
The rendezvous.
Rendezvous, well, rendezvous were a time where, at the end of the fur trade, some of the biggest rendezvous in the country were up at Perdichy. And the reason being is that's where the Wisconsin River goes up into the Great Lake. So all of the people from the Mississippi River and west of the Mississippi River that came down these streams, Iowa was full of fur traders, you know, long before Julien Dubuque came here, you know, and they would come down, they would rendezvous up at Perdichy, and that would be where they would sell a lot of the furs and maybe get trade goods, have a big party, you know, basically. They were happy that the winter was over and it was time to get together and see old friends in the spring.
But they did this annually, I understood. And the word got around out west where it's gonna be, is that correct?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, and people were traveling all up and down, they knew where it was gonna be, and they knew about what time. You know, as soon as the ice went out, they would go back up. One thing that I'll mention, and I'll be done, you can leave, is in processing the furs, mercury was used. Mercury would be put in with the fur, and it would do what they call keratin. It would make the fibers of the fur kind of get split ends, make it real soft. And so it made it a lot easier to make the felt, to make the hat, by using mercury. Problem is the hatters always had their hands down in mercury and fur. They're always working it. The life of a hatter, they say, was probably about 30. That was an average life expectancy. Very dangerous, low-class job. And you hear about the Mad Hatter, of course, in Alice in Wonderland, and that's where that came from, using all the mercury. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the book written a couple years ago by Jerry Answer about Jim Bridger?
Yeah.
And that was the fur trading years later than the Butte area. But it's really full of statistics and interesting information about trading.
Yeah, and that's more of the mountain fur trade. You say years later, you know, and as you asked about the beaver being depleted. As the beaver got depleted along the Mississippi River and some of the feeder streams and rivers, then the fur trade kept moving out west, further west. Another big trade that was going on was out of the Pacific for the sea otter. Sea otter were also very important during the fur trade, but that was a whole different. So the whole country, basically, North America, Canada, was they didn't have a lot of gold here, but they did have furs, lead, some of the things like that.
Did you say otter felt was also used, or otter for felt or not?
Not for felting.
Not so much.
Yeah, just fur as it is, you know. They could make like hat brims and collars. People would make muffs out of otters, you know. So otters were the ermine. Ermine was important. Ermine is a white weasel. Instead of the brown summer weasel, it's the white winter weasel. And in Europe, it used to be that it was illegal for any commoner to have a weasel in their fur because it was reserved for kings and queens. And if you ever notice old pictures, you might see a king or a queen wearing a beautiful cape that's all white with little black dots on it. Look for that if you look at some old pictures. That's the tail of the weasel that was put into that cape. And so, interesting. But I'm kind of, yeah.
You mentioned that they did a lot of their travel with birch bark canoes, big birch bark canoes. Would they have made them themselves, or maybe bought them from the Indians?
Both, yeah. They bought them from the Indians, but the French actually had a factory that they made their own birch bark canoes at Trois Rivières, Canada. And they would make these big canoes, 27-footers, 36-footers, you know, and they would make them specifically for the fur trade, really heavily built. Yeah. I built a birch bark canoe. My wife's from northern Minnesota, so I gathered all the materials, and I've got it at home in my garage. It's just too big to bring here today. You know, it's an 18-footer, so it's just a individual one, but they're strong. You know, you think of the birch bark is not that strong, but the wood ribbing inside and the planking that's in there, then the birch bark is just basically the skin that's on the outside that keeps the water out. And even in the canoes, people would carry extra roots with them. They would carry extra pieces of birch bark. They could actually at night turn that canoe over if there was a rip in it and cut out a patch, take out a few ribs and sew in a new birch bark patch, caulk it with some pine tar, and be on the road, on the water, I should say, the next day. You know, you can't do that with an aluminum canoe, duct tape, I guess. But, yeah.
Many years ago, as a teacher, you did a program for these kids. Now here you're still doing this program, but it's amazing. It's even better. I mean, I'm just saying.
Why
You've
keep
been doing
learning
this
more?
a long time, educating all of us around here. I just wanted to congratulate you on that longevity.
Thank you, and I understand, I did it at Mines of Spain, I think, back in, up at the monument, I think in 1988, they ran it on TV forever around here. Yeah.
I was just gonna mention, you mentioned Jerry Ensler's book on Jim Bridger. Well, there's a new biography of Julien Dubuque. Bob Klein, longtime librarian at Morris College, has written Julien Dubuque, Portrait of a Pioneer, and that's available down at River Lights Bookstore.
Oh, good.
So if you're interested in Julien Dubuque himself, that's the newest biography.
Good. A lot of great resources. Yeah.
Just a couple questions. Just roughly, what time did the Meskwaki live here? The other thing I had heard that they were from the same part of Canada as Julien Dubuque, not far from where Julien Dubuque is.
Well, he was actually, I think he was born further north, you know, he was closer to Quebec City. I think he was born in Quebec City. And the Meskwaki were more down around the Great Lakes, so, I mean,
He came from Canada originally, right?
yeah, he did.
And the Meskwaki.
And actually, Julien Dubuque had a brother that worked for Fur Trade too. I think Adrian Dubuque.
So the mid 1650s or roughly, do you think Meskwaki came here?
Yeah, probably around that, 1600.
So did, they ship hide to Europe? Like deer hide?
Yeah, they did, yeah.
Didn't they have deer in Europe? Were they all depleted?
They have, you're right, they had beaver in Europe too. But the beaver had been long depleted before then. They still have some now, they're making a comeback, but they had a European beaver. So the American beaver, then that was a whole market that existed. Same way with in Europe, you know, the roebuck and things like that. Chamois, a lot of them have been hunted, so there was a whole new market in this resource in this country to shoot back. And you wouldn't think it paid, but it did. You know, all the birch bark canoe trips, and then they would offload in Montreal, put them into ships, take them all the way back. And that's one reason so many of the beaver hides deteriorated. You know, packed in the hold of a ship for how many months to get back to Europe. It must have been a stinky mess, you know, if they weren't fleshed well enough. If you don't get all the meat and all the fat off those hides, they're going to spoil. You know, so it's very important. Yeah.
Do you know if any of Wagner Julien's original documents are in existence, and if so, where?
Who's?
Marquette Julian.
Oh, Marquette.
Your original documents are in
The original documents, Marquette was a Jesuit.
Yes.
And so there's a book called The Jesuit Relations. It's all written in French. And it's been translated into English, but his documents were in there.
Where are they today?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. But
And also the Richard Herman, you know, he was the original historian from Dubuque.
oh yeah, this yeah.
Whatever happened to him? Like if somebody wanted to go see all that.
A lot of the Herman collection is actually in the Dubuque Historical Society. But you can't just go and see it. A lot of it's in the archives. They bring out pieces now and then that have been other exhibits, but yeah, it's just hard to display all because his whole house was just full of cases. I mean, at the ham house, they used to have cases and cases of stuff. but,
but they're just, it's,
yeah,
That should all be available, I would think, for the youth
it's in
and
this facility.
communities.
yeah. There's just not enough room, there was so much, you know. You know, I worked for the Historical Society
But
for a
you
while.
have to have a river museum. You have to pay all that to come in, access, I would think you should have that.
It didn't take a month, one bigger building, they've got now. Well, I'm gonna end my program. Good question.